escalation of gambling despite the occurrence of negative consequences. And those are the three components. Interestingly enough, one of the most prized, most commonly used, measure of problem gambling was actually developed looking at the DSM-5 criteria and is paralleled with that. I want to make mention, because this is incredibly important, is most of our research is on the idea of problem gambling. Now, problem gambling is not itself a clinical diagnosis. It's a level of risk. Right? Individuals, it's on a continuum. The lower the scores, the lower the risk. The higher the scores, the higher the risk. As such, it measures individuals' problem gambling behaviors and it places them on this continuum of a risk, but it doesn't provide them a clinical diagnosis. Now, what's important is that most of our prevalence rates are typically based on problem gambling and based on these cutoffs from problem gambling, not necessarily based on a clinical diagnosis. While there's a lot of validity in the measures that we use, it's just an important caveat to keep in the back of your mind when we talk about some of the prevalence rates. Speaking of which, prevalence rates for problem gambling, worldwide, they range from less than 1% to as much as 8%. And this does vary substantially by different countries, with some European countries reporting higher than others, and similar in the Asian continent. And one question I have here is, will the prevalence rates change within the changing landscape of gambling? One thing that we're seeing in the United States is that rates do appear to be increasing. Currently, or at least in the last 5 to 10 years, we've always assumed that the rates are somewhere between less than 1% to as much as 2%. But recently, and this could be a byproduct of the legalization of sports betting and the expansion of online gambling within the United States, but we are seeing rates that are exceeding 5 to 7%, depending upon the state that it was being assessed in. Further research is definitely necessary and needed to examine the risk for problem gambling nationally. Within the National Council on Problem Gambling, that recent paper that I mentioned previously that was recently published, individuals endorsed, 31% of all US adults endorsed at least one criteria of problem gambling. Now, it wasn't an exhaustive self-report measure, but nonetheless, it does hint at the idea that problem gambling is probably more than just 2% of the population. And many people have suspected that we might be underestimating the prevalence of problem gambling due to, in large part, because many mental health professionals have dismissed the severity of problem gambling, focusing primarily on substance use disorders, which it's a false comparison, are problematic. But in the issues in the United States is that often mental health professionals won't ask the simple question, are you gambling? So that needs to be addressed. Speaking of which, in order to prepare individuals with regards to asking that question, what is the best screener? I mentioned before the Problem Gambling Severity Index. It's listed here, these 9 questions. Referencing in the past 12 months, have you bet more than you could really afford to lose? Have you needed to gamble with larger amounts of money to get the same feeling of excitement? When you gambled, did you go back another day to try to win back the money you lost? This references chasing, this idea that individuals are chasing their money that they've lost. Have you borrowed money or sold anything to get more money to gamble? Have you felt that you might have a gambling problem? Has gambling caused you any health problems, including stress or anxiety? Have people criticized your betting or told you that you had a gambling problem, regardless of whether or not you thought it was true? Has your gambling caused financial problems for you or your household? And finally, have you felt guilty about the way you gamble or what happens when you gamble? These items are all rated from 0 to 3. Scores of 8 or more are considered to be reaching that high risk, high probability of a gambling disorder. And it's a widely used scale, even though it's referencing many of the DSM-5 criteria, but it's used worldwide and has been adapted in many languages and is one that I do recommend to include in intakes. A shorter version, and one of the reasons why I highlight this one, is because it was identified in a study by Nikki Dowling and colleagues in their review of screening measures. They used the PGSI, which I just previously went over, as the standard, right? So it wasn't considered as one of the other screening measures. Rather, it was used as a standard to compare other measures, which is one of the reasons why I highlight the PGSI as, if there is room, if there is time, include the 9-item version. I believe it is a strong measure relative to what else is available. But their review of measures identified the brief problem gambling screen. This includes the 5 items that you see. This was developed by Rachel Wahlberg and Robert Williams. The response options for this one is is yes or no, and scores of 1 or more are indicative of potential problem gambling, so for further interview and further diagnosis. Either of these measures are appropriate. The other thing I would ask is that if individuals have the space and time, is to identify what type of gambling activities individuals are engaging in. One thing that we know about gamblers, especially individuals who are more problematic than others, is that they do tend to have a preference for specific gambling activities. However, they are a bit more like omnivores when it comes to gambling. They are searching for that risk. So while they might come into the casino and they might try to enter the poker room, they may strike out and then try to find another activity. Or when taking a break from poker, they might then go play craps or something else. So it is interesting to still assess and to be able to hold account what activities individuals are engaging in on an annual basis. I'm going to move into predictors and outcomes. And this is, again, quite an exhaustive list. I could go on. Some individuals have explored the personality and individual differences, impulsivity, neuroticism, poor emotion regulation, which does go hand in hand with both of those, impulsivity and neuroticism. Antisocial traits have also been found to be a correlate of problem gambling. Some motivations, strong coping or enhancement motivations, the idea that individuals are looking for that euphoria they experience when they're risking money. A real quick side note, one of the things that often is confused within the literature or within the mainstream media is that the neuroscience of gambling has actually showed us that individuals' activation of the reward center is most highly activated on near misses, not wins, but the point at which they almost won. That's when it's most highly activated. It's really interesting, but it drives them to then gamble again. Adverse childhood experiences, substance use, and parental gambling, all of these put individuals at an increased risk for problem gambling. Unfortunately, I can't nominate any of these from this list as a prominent predictor. I think all of them have their place. And as we'll see within Blazinski and Nauer's pathways model, we'll see that all of these are somewhat intertwined in the etiology of different pathways to problem gambling or gambling disorder specifically. The outcomes or correlates of problem gambling are just as varied. Depression, anxiety, suicide, and self-harm. In fact, there are some literature out there. It hasn't been consistent, but some literature does suggest that in certain contexts, problem gambling may put individuals at a greater risk for suicide and self-harm than substance use disorders. Again, that has not necessarily always been consistent. Nonetheless, there's still a positive association. Whether or not it's greater than substance use disorders or not doesn't really completely matter because it's still a risk factor. Relational conflicts, criminal behavior, especially gambling motivated crime. Again, individuals trying to acquire more capital in order to gamble. Increased risk for substance use, as well as an increased risk for employment issues. I keep on mentioning the pathways model, and so now I want to spend a bit of time discussing this model. This is the paper. This is the it's a seminal paper in our field, and it speaks to 3 different pathways in which to understand individuals' development of gambling disorder. Hopefully, that the idea and further research is needed by identifying individuals' etiology for their gambling disorder and their unique journey that they have taken in order to develop a gambling disorder. It can inform clinical intervention and treatment approaches. Now, there are 3 pathways that are proposed, and all of these have been supported in at least 3 to 5 different papers and more. And even more are actually applying it beyond pathological gambling There's one study that comes to mind by Jamie Lister and colleagues out on opioid use disorder. Just as a side note, Dr. Nauer and Dr. Blazinski developed the Pathways Questionnaire, which has been validated in a couple different languages. I know in English as well as Italian, and I believe there's another couple different versions being validated elsewhere as well. And so this measure has been utilized and has been showing some strong validity. And what it does is it provides a score to separate individuals from the 3 different pathways. So what are the 3 different pathways? Pathway 1 references a behaviorally conditioned group of gamblers. These individuals, these groups of gamblers are more interested in the thrills and rewards. They've become conditioned on this. It's very much taken from the learning literature. And their entire conditioning is based on the stimulation. One of the important pieces of this, I'm skipping to the 3rd bullet point here, is that this group does not really have a strong pre-existing risk for gambling disorder. For instance, anxiety and depression are not pre-morbid. They don't come before individuals develop a gambling disorder, but they do come usually afterwards. As their gambling becomes more problematic, individuals begin to endorse more issues with depression and anxiety. Now, the pathway 1 gamblers often move in and out of meeting the gambling disorder classification. For that purposes, it's possible that these could be maybe some of the more easier, I hesitate to use that term, gamblers to work with, because for them, we might be focusing more on their motivations, focusing more on what they believe they're getting out of gambling is an easy way to start to address some of the issues and some of the improper cognitions they may have attached to gambling and some of those conditioning forces. Pathway 2 references individuals who are emotionally vulnerable. Pathway 2 gamblers experience similar conditioning from the rewards and thrills as Pathway gamblers 1, but there's a key difference here. Pathway 2 gamblers do have this history of emotional problems. Anxiety and depression are pre-morbid for these individuals. So that could be in part driving them towards engaging in gambling problematically, using it more as a self-medication activity, using it as a way of potentially making themselves feel better or enhancing those positive emotions and bringing down the negative emotions, or at least distracting them. As the research suggests, even amongst substance use disorders, they might endorse the idea of modifying, bringing down the negative affect, but really it's more of a distracting from the negative affect, suppressing those feelings. Origins of adverse childhood experiences, so life trauma, and also a lack of developing coping skills. I know that there are some discussions of some neuroscience. I'm not aware of it being released yet, of trying to explore whether or not this pathway is also associated with different areas of the brain. I'm thinking of the amygdala, for instance, with regards to being either hyperactive or hypoactive. I believe either could actually have a valid hypothesis with regard to this population. Finally, the 3rd pathway is the antisocial impulsivist. These individuals also, just as the pathway 2, they experience similar rewards and thrills as pathway 1 gamblers. And that's a consistent. Gambling is thrilling, it is fun. Even for individuals who do not reach the threshold, gambling can be rewarding and thrilling and exciting. The key difference here for pathway 3 gamblers is that individuals are more impulsive, they're risk takers, and they report higher antisocial behaviors. Now, for pathway 3, this could be a more difficult group of gamblers to work with, in part due to their compliance, due to them being more combative. And that is something that the clinician would have to take into account when working with this subset of gamblers. For pathway 2 gamblers, and I apologize, I forgot to mention, because of their likely history of adverse childhood experiences or life traumas, trauma-informed therapy might be the best approach. One comes to mind is Seeking Safety as a program that's available online. A recent paper that was just recently published in 2021 in Addiction by Nauer and her team clarified these gambling subtypes. They clarified that in addition to, not in addition to, I apologize, Pathway 1, Pathway 2, and Pathway 3 were all confirmed, but there was just a slight difference with Pathway 3 that they underscore here. While impulsivity, antisocial, narcissistic traits, and risk-taking were there as expected from the original theory, they found that meaning and coping motivation were actually higher in Pathway 3 than in the other pathways. Coping motivation was still present in Pathway 2, but not really a meaning motivation. Now, what's interesting here, and it's interesting because of some of the work that my graduate student is doing on dispositional greed and problem gambling, is that we could be tapping into the emphasis that individuals place on gambling as a way of meeting their needs, as a way of meeting this status, this sense of prestige. And again, that would be consistent with more this antisocial, narcissistic perspective. All the other elements that I've previously described all stay the same in this clarification that was recently published. And it's a really interesting paper. I highly recommend it. And so when it comes to cognitive distortions, by the way, all pathways generally do start to endorse a higher level of cognitive and maladaptive distortions with relates to gambling. So that is the pathways model. And I'm going to move on now to the second part of this presentation. And I want to focus on the ever-changing landscape. At this point, we've discussed what is gambling. We've discussed what gambling harms look like. I've emphasized that problem gambling is not the only population that experiences gambling harms. We've discussed a bit about the contrast between gambling disorder and problem gambling, and I've shared some of the literature on some of the predictors and outcomes associated with problem gambling. I've also discussed at this point, as we've just finished, with an overview of the pathways model, which is just really, really influential in some of our research and some of the ways in which clinicians consider treating problem gambling worldwide. But I want to move into what I've been researching a bit more on the ever-changing landscape. And there's 4 or 5 different areas that I want to touch on. The first piece, and I want to touch on 4 different activities, I believe that's correct, 4 different activities in which the video games that we love have been gamblified. And I think many people are somewhat familiar with these, but this has become an increasing concern for the last, I would say, 10 years, especially over the last 5 years in particular. The first instance of this was social casino gaming. Now, the research on this has kind of dropped off a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what fully explains it. I'm not seeing as many papers uncover this, but social casino games are simulated gambling video games. Individuals can sometimes play the exact game, the exact slot machine, for instance, that they can find in a casino. If you're playing Double Down Casino, for instance, you can play Texas Hold'em, you can play Blackjack, very similar to the way that you could play with your online or in a casino. Now, research shows that there's a strong association between the engagement in these video games and gambling with real money and problem gambling. Now, this correlation, this association has led to a prominent hypothesis that social casino gaming may prime individuals to seek out real-world gambling opportunities. And generally speaking, I'm thinking of one study by Andrew Kim at Toronto Metropolitan University has generally supported this hypothesis, but it's the only one that I'm aware of that was longitudinal in nature. Hopefully, there are other studies out there that have explored this relationship longitudinally. Social casino gaming can also be problematic itself. Dr. Vivian Lee, Anthony Lee, and Rutgers University, I collaborated with her on a social casino gaming measure that's in international gambling studies. And one of the things that we found is that individuals do engage in this activity more so than other gambling-related activities, which suggests that individuals are investing a great deal of time, and their engagement in social casino gaming itself has become problematic. And they don't necessarily need to drift into real-world gambling, however, a lot of them do, in order for the problems to be amplified. Further, some governments have begun to view gambling on these social casino gaming websites or apps as gambling itself. Now, this is an interesting one. If we go back to the definition, the 3 different points, the wager, the chance, and the reward, for the longest time, social casino gaming has always had this special carve out. It's not really gambling, because the chips they're playing with, they don't have any value, right? And it's not really gambling because they're playing against other people. Sure, there's a little bit of a chance-based game, but as I mentioned in the definitions, if you don't have at least as all three of those components, it doesn't meet many countries' legal definition to be gambling. Now that has changed a little bit when we think about how individuals buy in-game chips. And when they purchase in-game chips using their money, they have now stated a value on those chips, whether they be more extrinsically valued or whether they're more intrinsically valued. We can also see that because individuals still have that chance, that piece is still met. And the reward piece, because individuals do value those chips, we can now argue that there is a sense of reward. And so that's been, some governments have started to view these chips in that way, which has really changed the possibility of social casino gaming being viewed as a gambling activity. But some of the litigation on that is still outstanding. The other gamification of video gaming comes in the form of loot boxes. Now, loot boxes are lottery-style boxes, chests, packs, player packs. I'm thinking of FIFA, for instance, where individuals buy a pack. It's like a digital card set, and you have different players. Now, they pay to open these, and most of the research is generally focused on the loot boxes that individuals pay to open. There are loot boxes that individuals can acquire through in-game performance, through leveling up, through various daily quests or whatnot. Generally speaking, the research doesn't pay attention as much to the quantity of boxes, loot boxes that individuals open for free, only those of the extent to which, or the frequency that individuals pay to open loot boxes. Purchasing loot boxes is correlated with problem gambling and gambling participation. Again, going back to the social casino gaming, it suggests that there could be this link. And again, the thought is, are individuals starting to be primed with regard to loot boxes, which leads them into gambling in real life and leads to eventual problems. Loot boxes have been banned in some countries due to them meeting some legal definitions for gambling, similar to the social casino gaming piece. Other countries, specifically in Europe and I believe some Asian countries, have begun to ban them outright from gaming consoles. But the effects of loot boxes are limited with regards to, but other effects of loot boxes limited to gambling and problem gambling. Some of the research that I've been a part of and co-authored with my colleagues in Rutgers, we explored the relationship between loot box purchases, again, focusing on the purchasing of loot boxes, not just the free loot boxes. That could be a component and has been something that has been brought up in our presentation of these results. But the purchasing of loot boxes to both problem video gaming and problem gambling. What we've found is that it's associated with both. It seems to be equally. Now, the takeaway from this finding is that, yes, there is an association. This was a cross-sectional study. It didn't actually, we weren't able to draw out any sort of inferences with regard to causality. So there is an association with, yes, problem gambling, but it's just as likely that individuals are going to meet problem video gaming as well. So this could be just a unique at-risk group that's drawn to the fun of video gaming and the appeal of gambling, and they're at risk for both. Further research is really needed to better understand the differences between individuals who meet different levels of problem video gaming and problem gambling, and to see if there's that association with regards to loot box purchases and other video game related gambling. Another emerging video game related gambling activity is esports betting. Now, as I say here, it's basically sports betting, but on esports competition. Esports competitions are organized single event or tournament events. And so they're not just one-on-one, however, that could be a form of betting where players come together and they just bet on their own performance. But it could be, it's usually more typically defined as esporting events such as Dota, League of Legends. These are huge events. Some statistics show that more people watched esports competitions in the previous year than the NFL Super Bowl. We'll see if those statistics hold up, but it appears that that's going to be a general trend. Now, one study found that esports betting is associated with more severe gambling-related harms than traditional sports betting. Now, that was a comparison between predominantly esports bettors and traditional sports bettors which esports bettors were generally younger and also engaging in other gambling-related activities than their traditional sports bettor peers. That's the only study I know to date to do that comparison. I'm looking forward to seeing if there's going to be other research coming out that tries to replicate those findings. Now, what's also interesting is that esports players that or watchers tend to bet more on esports. And so there does appear to be this relationship between the people who engage in the sport of esports, engage in the activity of esports, also become bettors themselves. One of the things that we're often very concerned about in terms of sports betting is making sure that the integrity of the game stays whole. And so that is something to keep our eye on and watch as esports continues to grow. And I'm guessing esports betting expands as well. As a side note, I forgot to mention this here and put a bullet point. There are some states that allow daily fantasy sports in the US, and esports betting, esports competitions have become a part of daily fantasy sports. I'm not sure how popular it is with regards to some of the internal data, but I'm aware both DraftKings and FanDuel allow for individuals to make a team, a roster of esport players for a competition in a similar daily fantasy sports format as the NFL or Major League Baseball, for instance. One that I find incredibly interesting and has shown to be extraordinarily risky, especially for adolescents, is skin betting. So skin betting, and the definition does seem to vary by paper. This is my definition based on some of the review of the literature by some researchers in Australia, researchers in the UK. But generally speaking, is using in-game items, often things that change the appearance of the character and not necessarily the performance of the game. However, that seems to be somewhat changing, as collateral on a third-party site. So you play a game, and this is the process here, just to better understand. You play a game, and while you're playing that game, you obtain some in-game items. You set up an account on a third-party site. You transfer your in-game items from your own player profile to that site, and a couple things can happen. The first is that some sites will sell the items right away based on a set price, and so they'll buy them from the player and give them collateral tokens or whatnot. And then the player can go and play those tokens and use those tokens to wager in other games. And so that's one way in which it can work. The other way is that they can transfer their in-game items to the site, and then the site will post them on a marketplace. And basically, they have to wait until their items are sold for that in-game currency, which then is deposited in their site. Either way, once the items are sold, players have access to the site's token to use at various online gambling activities. It's also important that many of these third-party sites use cryptocurrency or credit cards to purchase additional tokens. As a result, they end up becoming basically these social casino gaming venues where individuals are purchasing additional tokens with real money, but the tokens really have no value outside of the game. Some players can use the tokens to buy and go to that marketplace that I mentioned previously to buy some in-game items and then transfer them out. That's one of the rewards pieces here, is that they're hoping to get more of the site's tokens so that they can use in the marketplace. In some ways, I've thought of it as more of akin to these in the United States. We have Chuck E. Cheese, for instance, where kids go and they acquire a bunch of tickets and they use to then buy some prize at the end. I want to turn now to gambling within the financial markets. And I previously mentioned cryptocurrencies. That's going to be a piece that I'm going to discuss, but this is one that I'm very interested in. And I think it's really, really interesting, especially what we saw in the United States and elsewhere with regards to some of the options trading, for instance. So one of the things I want to start with and make this bold claim and discuss is first pose the question, is stock trading gambling? And the fun part about having a presentation online is that it's kind of a rhetorical question, but this is often where we have this interesting carve out, right, from what is traditionally viewed as gambling. And then for whatever reason, historically, we've always said, but investing is very different, right? And stock trading itself is very different, which is funny because I have many friends who ended up going into the financial sector, and they have no problem calling what they do gambling. But let's talk about it. There's a great paper by Jennifer Arthur, Robert Williams, and Paul DeFalbro, and they give these three different terms: gambling, investing, and speculation. And I'm going to borrow their table, table one. They really pose these conceptual similarities and differences between gambling, speculation, and investment. They talk about the time frame first and foremost, that it's usually when it comes to gambling, it's short-lived, right? When it comes to speculation, which of course they argue is somewhere in this middle part where it's not really investment, but it's not really gambling either. It's variable. It could be short, it could be long. But investment, and this is traditionally what everyone usually thinks about, is that investment is always long-term investments, right? It's always on the long, right? You're buying stocks and you're holding them for 10, 20 years. What I think is interesting is that that's starting to change a little bit. The time frame is starting to change, and if you talk to a lot of financial advisors, they'd say that the time horizon really varies by individuals' goals and their portfolios. And individuals could have a very short time frame, which could be appropriate for them depending upon what they're trying to do. And also, if they're lucky and they're fortunate and their stock goes up very quickly, they might sell very quickly and pay those additional taxes depending upon the country's policies. I also have underlined here is that the role of chance. And you can see that for gambling, speculation, and investment, the role of chance is quite high. So we do have the notion of individuals having at least that one component of chance. This is where it gets a little bit interesting, and I'm not sure that I completely agree, but this is where it's interesting with regards to whether or not individuals purchase assets. When it comes to gambling, you don't. When it comes to investing, you purchase stocks or other financial assets. And when it comes to investing, do you stake? And this is where they draw a distinction in their paper, Arthur and colleagues do, with regards to viewing the asset purchase as not staking their position. I generally see not really that much of a difference, and I don't really think that many retail investors do see that much of a difference between staking one's position by buying stock. Yes, you own the stock, or you own the financial asset, maybe it's an options contract or cryptocurrency, but is that really all that different than putting $50 down at a blackjack table? I think there could be some people, some reasonable individuals that disagree. And is there a definitive outcome? In investment, they say usually not. In speculation, they say usually, right? And this is usually where they talk about options contract, that definitive deadline and outcome. So these are some of the conceptual similarities and differences with regards to investment, speculation, and gambling. Now, for my own purposes, and this is my own definition, not theirs, I view gambling as an umbrella term for risking anything of value for the chance of gaining something of greater value. That's the same definition I proposed earlier in this presentation. I view gambling as this thing on the top, right above, and investing and speculating as indicative of level of risk. And so this is how I would draw it out with that label there. So for the purposes of what I see is I do see that any investing, even if it's a low risk, individuals are still gambling. And I view that to be a little bit of an easier definition to understand. And that's how I view the stock market. So I do view engaging the stock market, while I generally do view it to be a responsible thing, especially done with a financial advisor, I do view it as an appropriate thing. I do view it as gambling. Do view it as risking some money now for the hopes that in the future you're going to have a larger portfolio value. But nonetheless, hopefully it's low risk and not high risk. Right? The public generally seems to agree with my perspective. Blind buying blue chips. This is a paper from Williams and colleagues in 2011. They surveyed nearly 13,000 North American adults. And what they found is, and I've highlighted the two arrows there, they found that buying blue chip stocks, these are typically viewed as like the best stocks. I believe at the time Microsoft would be there, maybe probably now it would be like Netflix and Facebook and all those different stocks, the stocks that we think are going to always be around, McDonald's, for instance, right? These blue chip stocks that are highly valued. More than a third believe that buying blue chip stocks, which are supposed to be safe investments, are gambling. When it comes to buying high-risk stocks, now this is always poorly defined and really depends on the individual. Generally speaking, though, when we ask that question, we are assuming that individuals are referring to things like penny stocks. These are low-valued assets. These are usually things that are less than $5, even less than $1 on the stock market that people buy. They buy in great quantity because of the possibility of a high bounce going to the moon. More people in this survey viewed buying high-risk stocks as gambling than betting on sports. And I think that's kind of interesting. So to me, again, just to me, I believe buying stocks, I believe engaging in the financial markets is a form of gambling. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean that all gambling is high risk. There are some gambling that's quite low risk. For instance, as indicated in this graphic, purchasing insurance for 6.8% of the population or the people surveyed, they view that as a form of gambling. So some of the things that have been noted in the literature, stock trading is buying and selling shares of companies after a period of more than 24 hours. So this is the traditional way of individuals holding on to shares of a company. I want to focus on some of the literature here with regards to day trading, buying and selling shares of a company within a single day trading day. So maybe you buy in the morning and then you immediately sell before the end of day. That's considered day trading. And the other form here is trading on margin, when individuals buy or sell shares using some loaned money. What's interesting about this is that stock trading just in general is associated with greater gambling and greater problem gambling. However, day trading appears to be a greater risk factor. I'm not aware of any study that has explored trading on margin or the extent to which individuals use that. I think that would be really, really interesting, but I'm not aware of anyone with that. That being said, typically my understanding from financial investors is that if individuals are engaging in day trading, they typically are trading on margin, at least for that short period, because they can do, and that's trading on margin again is a loan, but they can actually trade on margin for that day without accruing any interest on that loan because it hasn't lapsed to another day. Cryptocurrencies, and I'm one of the first people to study cryptocurrencies in relationship to problem gambling, but cryptocurrencies are digital assets that are inherently speculative. Okay? These are different than stocks, which are shares of a company. There are pieces of an existing company. Now, companies can vary substantially in terms of their quality, but technically speaking, you own a piece of that company. There's something there that you actually own, right? Cryptocurrencies, on the other hand, are inherently speculative. There is nothing really that you own. It is a digital bit of code that you have access to. Now, they're inherently speculative, as I keep on mentioning, and cryptocurrency exchanges are always open. The stock market has hours. Now, there are a number of different markets all throughout the world, and very savvy investors might be accessing all sorts of markets. Research has shown, and my study is one of the first, Paul DeFelbro and Daniel King out of Australia were a second, that largely replicated our findings, has shown that trading cryptocurrencies is associated with greater problem gambling. It suggests that while we can't say there's a causal relationship, we can't say that cryptocurrencies are more addictive. I hate when individuals ask that question, but I understand the question, than other gambling activities. What we can only say so far is that there does appear to be an inherent appeal to cryptocurrencies amongst individuals already looking for an increased risk, an increased appetite for risk. The other thing that I'll mention here with regard to cryptocurrencies, there was a great paper. It was more of an economic perspective by Pelster and colleagues. And what they did is they looked at brokerage accounts in the UK, and they ended up identifying individuals who traded cryptocurrencies. And they set up a time series analysis to assess at the point that they started to trade cryptocurrencies, what happened. And there was an increase in their use of margin, an increase of using loaned money, an increase of number of trades. Generally speaking, financial advisors will tell you the more trades that you make, the more likely you are to lose money in the long run. So what that simple paper explored and supported was the idea that even if we don't know whether or not they're reaching that criteria for problem gambling, we do see that they're engaging the market in a riskier way, even once they start trading in cryptocurrencies. Now, that could be a variety of different reasons. It could be the risk appeal that these traders had. Uh, More research is needed on that. And then from crypto to gaming and back, this is a recent study by Delic and Paul DeFabro. An emerging type of video gaming is where individuals are paid to play. It's pay to earn gaming. And generally speaking, individuals are earning money through cryptocurrencies. Their paper explored a very popular video game, Axie Infinity. I think it's lost some of its popularity over the last couple years, but nonetheless, it has been extremely popular for a while. And what's interesting about these games, and there's not much research, I believe this is the only study out there, is whether or not individuals are more at risk for problem gambling. We don't know yet, but we could argue that it could be kind of this almost gateway. I like to frame it as almost like enter through gift shop, exit through gift shop sort of mentality. Individuals have to go through the crypto market, access cryptocurrencies in order to access the game. And so let's say you just want to access the game, you have no interest in cryptocurrencies, but you have to, because that's how the game is set up. You have to access the cryptocurrency market in order to gain cryptocurrency, in order to buy access into the game. And then in order to benefit from the play to earn model, you are then paid cryptocurrencies, which then again means that you have to, again, access that cryptocurrency market. Again, cryptocurrencies being a highly speculative, highly volatile asset, it increases individuals' risk and exposure to a gambling activity very much indirectly through this type of game. Further research is definitely needed to really see whether or not this increases individuals' appetite for cryptocurrencies if they start to play more, if they develop other habits, or if it affects their mental health in some way. So I want to conclude, and I know that I've been going quite a bit, so I want to conclude here. Where do we go from here? And to be completely honest, it's a bit of a mystery. From my perspective, one thing is certain. Gambling will increase worldwide, even if governments work to limit access. We always gamble. Humans have it historically. Love gambling. We do. And gambling historically has been around in many ancient populations and will continue to exist regardless of what governments do. So I don't necessarily know if it's possible to restrict the many ways that people gamble. One thing I didn't mention was the emergence of crypto casinos, which use cryptocurrency as a way of gambling. These are often unregulated. These are often in jurisdictions that governments cannot restrict, often don't utilize geofencing technology, and they're constantly popping up. It's very difficult, I would imagine, for governments to limit access to these casinos, these online casinos. Harm reduction is important here, and that's what I want to leave with this thought process here. Further research is really needed to identify the different ways individuals are gambling. And then once that is identified, maybe it's not the emphasis of trying to restrict access, but it's more the emphasis on trying to increase harm reduction efforts through campaign awareness, through ensuring that there are prevention efforts, as well as there's increased treatment for individuals struggling with problem gambling. Generally do believe that individuals will always find a way to access gambling, just like individuals will always find a way to access and to obtain the drug of their choice in order to get a high. I believe that individuals will do the same thing with regards to gambling. If they want to gamble, they will find a way to gamble. And so focusing on the harm reduction way is a way of minimizing those negative consequences of gambling that are ultimately inevitable for individuals who gamble problematically. So with that, I've seen that there have been some questions. I will definitely stop here and respond to some questions. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully this worked out well, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mills. We do have, indeed, we have some few questions that we have. So the first one is, can you expound further on the role of dopamine in addiction?
Yes, I mean, we tend to think dopamine as the neurotransmitter that's salient with regards to all forms of addiction. We tend to believe, at least from the neuroscience, and the research does support this, that dopamine underscores individuals' risk. And so it's the activities, it's the substances that enhance the stimulation, the activation of dopamine within the brain that leads to greater future engagement and overall addiction if individuals start to kind of rewire the brain, if you will. So I believe I believe that answers the question. I apologize. That's kind of a broad question, but yeah, dopamine is definitely something that's implicated even within gambling itself.
So that's something that I think shares similarities with substances. So we sort of looked into this neurotransmitter changes when we talked about the brain, and dopamine seems to be the star there. So if you have questions, feel free to use the chat box. But I do have a question, sir. So I noticed that the central variable in gambling is about financial loss. So did we see like some differences when it comes to socioeconomic status? Because if I'm gamble and I'm poor, I would lose easily, right? So, are there literature that supports that so far?
It's SES, like many demographic variables, it's more nuanced than that, unfortunately, right? And so, first off, SES is not always the same across different counties, even nationally. When we look at SES, we try to do some sort of national associations with that. Make having an annual salary of 50,000 in New York City is very different than an annual salary in rural Texas, for instance, right? And so we need to also kind of make sure that we're conceptualizing SES and bringing in the appropriate factors. But to speak simply about it, there's been some literature on whether or not individuals of lower SES are risking a greater proportion of their money than individuals of upper SES. One hypothesis has been that there is this desire for moving different classes. And so class mobility and the lack thereof could be driving individuals to risk more. Potentially, when individuals feel as though that there's no real way of changing their circumstances, but through a jackpot, through a long shot, that they might take the risk. And the perspective there has often been, well, why not? I have nothing else that's going to get me, that's going to change my circumstances. So why not take that risk and see what happens? And so that's been one area of research. I believe it's Callan out of the UK who's done some literature, some research on that. But I'm not really familiar with any study that has generally shown individuals of lower SES to be at higher risk for problem gambling. I think that could depend on the country and could depend on the context. It definitely seems to depend in some part on the timeline too. We saw different countries, different cultures reacted differently to the 2008 recession, for instance. In some countries, actually, lottery ticket sales went down rather than up. I believe it was in a Scandinavian country, they looked at the effect of COVID on gambling, and that actually seemed to increase it. So, and we know with COVID, a lot of unemployment was increased across worldwide. So I think does that answer your question a bit?
Yes, it does, sir. So thank you. There's another question, and since you mentioned COVID, we know that during the time of COVID, there was a rise of people who were actually doing online gambling, and there's a question here if there are studies that show that it's a partial gateway for adolescents, but are we seeing the progression from online gambling to becoming problem gamblers so far?
So that is the hypothesis, and there's very little evidence to support it, but there's not really evidence to not support it either. It just hasn't been explored. I think it does make some sense, but the one thing I would just underscore here is that there does appear to be some overlap between individuals who endorse meet criteria for problem video gaming, as well as problem gambling. Um, and so it's not that they go hand in hand. I think the correlation at best is somewhere around maybe 0.2 to 0.3. So it's not immensely strong, but there is an added risk for individuals meeting both problem video gaming and problem gambling. One thing I would also say is that just because individuals don't meet one or the other, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't have elevated levels as well. So that's something to also keep in mind. In terms of whether or not individuals are inevitably, for instance, adolescents who play video games, experience some video game related gambling within their video game playing, are they going to bleed into gambling outside of video gaming in real life? We don't know for sure if all of them will. My expectation is that some of them might, definitely for sure, because they like that appeal, they like the risk, they like the thrill of gambling. But there's also a number of them that's going to feel more invested, more entranced by the video gaming itself, rather than trying to find other gambling activities outside of the video game. They become more invested, if you will, in the video gaming experience, if that makes sense. But further research is definitely needed on that front.
Mm. Okay, thank you so much. There is Mr. Madura, if you can just elaborate on this. I think, but this is more of the network where gambling is being held, like via text messages or SMS and web. Like the adverse conditions, I think were already discussed a little by Dr. Mills. So if you can expand on that, that would be helpful. Okay,
Sure.
there are other questions, sir. So we still have like 9 minutes. So the first one is you have, I think this pertains to the instrument, like in the past 12 months. Let's say that the person answers negatively because of the time frame. Okay, so I think it pertains more to the diagnostic criteria, sir. So how does, okay, so basically I think what he wanted to ask is how do we actually establish like that a person has a gambling disorder? So,
Sure. And that's going to be through a clinical diagnosis. It's going to be through an interview. And just like an interview in terms of identifying individuals meeting the threshold for major depressive disorder, individuals meeting the threshold for substance use disorder, it refers to using the text that you're accustomed to using, whether it's the ICD-11 or whether it's the DSM-5, and ensuring that individuals meet that cutoff. Um, I am not myself actually a clinical psychologist, so I'm not going to opine much further on that in terms of the methods that individuals use. I do know that, of course, it's more of a art and craft and kind of mixed in with the science in terms of diagnosing. And so that's where the true art of being a mental health professional and a clinician comes into play, trying to delineate between individuals' secondary and primary diagnoses. When it comes to utilizing the brief problem gambling screen again, and I apologize, I did flash those, and I'll work with Werner to make sure that these slides are available. And if there's ever any paper that you'd like access to, please shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to get those to you. Um, it is more of a reference point. So the problem gambling severity index, typically 8 or higher if on a total score, is usually the cutoff that we impose. That's for more research purposes. But if individuals are reporting even 2 or 3 points, it might be worth to explore that further in a clinical interview. The same with any other measure, any other intake that you would do. The biggest issue that I see when speaking with clinicians, they're not aware that they should even ask the question. They're so focused on the substance use disorder that they don't even ask the question about problem gambling and tend to actually rate it lower in terms of its risk severity and harm.
okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mills. And if I might add, I think that this issue is not only pertinent to gambling addiction, but also in substance use disorders. Like we sort of have a challenge in diagnosis because of the duration. That's why, as Dr. Mills mentioned, you rely on clinical judgment because the impairment might be more severe than the actual length of time that's written in the DSM. But however, one thing that we have to keep in mind also is that that diagnostic criteria are also evolving as we learn more about this. And addiction, like whether it's substances, more so on gambling, is actually a very new field. And there are a lot of things that it's very dynamic because we are also learning a lot. Okay.
Mhm. Well,
Um,
and it's very much there's a linguistic element too. If I understand from some individuals who have spoken to me, is that the idea of gambling, for instance, in Spanish, it doesn't always translate. as well in terms of how to actually discuss that. So there can be some differences, cultural differences and stuff. So further research is definitely needed. Cross-cultural validation is definitely needed to make sure that we're developing assessments, developing tools that account for these nuances in different cultures, in different contexts, that ensure that we're also accounting for the unique games that individuals play. Different countries have different gambling activities that are completely foreign to me, that I've never heard of, but are so common in those countries. So I think there's also just a great need to make sure that we have the cross-cultural research and emphasis in accounting for that.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, sir. That's actually one of the notes that I put here because, like, I know that there are certain there might be some cultural differences because sometimes it's integrated into their practices and into their celebration, and like some of it might be weird. I remember when I was young, like there are some Filipinos here that we do that the spider they fight, and then they like people would bet money on it, and it's something that is normally done like previously. So there's one more question here, and I think it pertains to the like, do we also see gambling addiction as a chronic disorder similar to SUD?
Correct, we do. Individuals who struggle with gambling um, are in recovery from gambling. They will be in recovery from gambling depending upon their own personal journey, their definition, and how they wish to identify. Maybe for the rest of their life, if they choose to identify as that, just similar to substance use disorders, the recovery piece is very much a personal journey and how they wish to identify. I have met individuals who identify as being in recovery for 10 to 20 years. Um, and the triggers are very similar, right? The idea of if one's preference was sports gambling, the idea of trying to work through how do I enjoy a game differently. It's the same type of notion of individuals who struggle with alcohol use, right? But they tend to watch the sport game, right? So instead of drinking, it's gambling, right? Instead of engaging with friends at a casino, it's engaging with friends at a bar. Like you have to then retrain yourself of how to engage in these different contexts and engage in the stimulus differently in order and have a different relationship with that. And so it is a lifetime for some individuals in terms of recovery. It is something that sometimes has to be extinguished, right? That's an ongoing debate in terms of the recovery field and whether or not everything has to be completely abstained from, or can individuals move out of problem gambling and into more safer gambling practices with some support and some limitations. That's an open question in both the gambling area as well as substance use disorder literature as well, in terms of better understanding that. I know there was another question. I just wanted to make sure that we got to it about the SMS. I, well, I'm not as familiar with that, but I mean, I think anything that increases access to gambling and making bets through SMS or through the web is going to increase individuals' risk. And so we're definitely seeing that. We're definitely seeing that individuals are gaining greater access to gambling activities, which is one of the reasons why I mentioned today that the prevalence of problem gambling appears to be increasing within the United States. Whether or not that's because of the new access, the new legalization, the expansion of online gambling, or whether that's because we've poorly assessed it previously, that kind of remains unknown at the moment. But it definitely seems to be much higher.
Okay. So are there any other question? Okay, so there's the last question, I guess, for this. What do you personally think is the solution to problem gambling? So, do you think that government's limitation would help?
Well, of course, just like anything, just like substance use disorders, it's got to be a bit of both. It's got to be a collaborative group of individuals coming together, whether it be for, it's got to include individuals at the highest level of government. It's got to include individuals at the lowest level, the most local levels of government. It's got to include people outside of government as well, who are working with community officials, who are working with people who really understand the needs of that community, the risks associated with it. It has to include individuals who are experts not just in mental health, but are experts in also adolescent development, as experts within the schools, experts within the community, whether the culture, whether it be more with regards to individuals who are religious leaders, depending upon what is used, whether it be elders and whatnot. It needs to be all encompassing, I think, to increase the most efficacy of any sort of policy and any sort of effort to really address gambling, problem gambling specifically. And then, from my own perspective, if done correctly, I think the legalization of gambling can be reduced in terms of its harms. To give you some context, here in Texas, we actually are one of the states with the most rigorous and strictest gambling laws. We don't allow a lot of gambling in the state, but our borders are surrounded by states that have gambling. And so a lot of Texans will drive across the state lines in order to access a casino. What's interesting about that is that Texas as a government tends to not view that as Texas's problem, right? Even though Texas adults are coming back to Texas with a gambling problem. Um, I bring that up to just emphasize the fact that number one, individuals who want to gamble will find access to gambling. And even before Texas ever had a lottery, Texas had a 2.5% prevalence rate for problem gambling, according to a 1992 survey. So even though you might not have gambling officially, you still will have gambling problem because, again, people will seek out gambling. So I drive this point home I mentioned this just to make sure that the point is heard, that it really includes a collective, a community. I'm not as worried about whether or not gambling is legal or not legal, or whatnot, or what the restrictions are. I'm more concerned about what are the ways in which individuals and communities and governments have provided a safety net to, one, reduce the harms and prevent the harms as much as possible through harm reduction approaches and safer gambling practices, and also provide a safety net to make sure that there are treatment supports for within the community, within every community, in order to help individuals and access that appropriately and affordably. That's my biggest concern, I guess.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mills. There's one last question. Can you still respond to this?
Of course.
Okay, so the question is about the changes in the brain or the biological damages that we know with regards to the brain because there's no pharmacological properties coming from substances.
I'm not aware of a lot of great research on this. Again, focusing more longitudinally. Mark Potenza at Yale University has done quite a bit of the research. I believe he's one of the pioneers in terms of neuroscience on in gambling. And so he studied that quite a bit. But if I'm not mistaken, and I hope if Mark does ever see this, I hope I don't misquote his research. But I believe much of his research has been more cross-sectional, looking at the cue activation, really underscoring the fact that these same regions of the brain that we see are activated during substance use are activated with gambling. And so that's incredibly important. But to your question of whether or not there's actual changes in the neural structures, changes in the neurochemistry, I would imagine that it has to be something to some extent, because that's what kind of drives this physiological, these cravings that are sometimes unprompted. That has to be, there has to be something there. I can't completely fully explain it. It's possible that over time, individuals who engage in it, who are quite susceptible to that, they rewire their neural structures, which ultimately changes the neurochemistry, rather than where substances, they start to change the neurochemistry, which ultimately changes the neural structures. Maybe that's what's going on, but that's highly speculative, and I have no idea if that's even supported in the neuroscience. And so that's me just kind of thinking outside the box. But it's an excellent question, and we definitely need more research to explore that question.
Okay, so thank you very much. So, Dr. Mills, to conclude this presentation, so we know that there's a lot of people that's gambling, but not everyone will have a disorder. So there are a lot of things that we are still finding out. There are different pathways that we are looking, so that might be interesting for you working in prevention. So this might be something that you would like to explore on creating prevention programs. Of course, when we talked about disorders, there would be maybe some physiological changes that we still have to know, because basically neuroplasticity is something that's being explored right now. So, and maybe like similar to substance use disorder, there will be progression to the disorder that we get to see. And with that, we thank you for first. Let me express our appreciation to Dr. Mills, who I bullied to do this presentation, even if he's my boss, and to Dr. Cho, who's our interpreter. And thank you to all of you participants, especially for bearing with us the first few minutes we're in where we are having technical issues and technical difficulties. So with that, I bid you a very good day. So thank you everyone and thank you for your questions. Until next quarter, have a good day everyone. And Dr. Mills, thank you. Good evening.
I guess.